Welcome to Seat at the Table, where we believe technical skills will get you in the room, but your soft skills and business acumen will earn you a seat at the table. My name is Jerich Beason, and I'm the host. So, we've covered a ton of topics, and we've talked about things that don't get a lot of attention, like navigating politics in the workplace or emotional intelligence, and many others. Today's topic gets even less attention, but I'm hoping that changes really soon. This February episode of Seat at the Table is, in my opinion, the most important episode we've done to date. Today, we're talking about neurodiversity and leading cyber in a neurodiverse workforce. Now, if this doesn't sound like a relevant topic for security leaders, hopefully at the end of this, you see otherwise. I'll say it until I am blue in the face. Security is a people business. And today's conversation is about people. A large population of people believed to be around about 30%. Now, I can go on and on about this, but let me introduce our guests. Today, we have Cynthia Coupe and Carraig Stanwyck. Can each of you share a little bit about yourself, please?
All right, I'll go first, I guess, since you said my name first. I am a speech-language pathologist by training. I have worked for over 20 years in the field of communication, and I have a daughter who's 12 years old who is autistic. During that, autistic and ADHD, and during her diagnosis process, I realized that I am also neurodivergent myself. Autistic, probably with a little bit of ADHD as well. I'm undiagnosed. I'm just self-diagnosed at this point, but fairly confident it's correct. And I work in the field of neurodivergency to educate communities and organizations as well about neurodiversity. So yeah, that's a bit of my background.
So my name is Carraig, and I am a cybersecurity leader, actually. Most of my life, everybody thought that I was a jerk, and it wasn't until I was older that I realized that being on the spectrum, the autism spectrum or Asperger's or whatever they're calling the flavor of the week this year, is going to let you see the world a little bit differently. And so I've really been blessed to come up and grow up and have the ability to assimilate and work on a lot of that and see the value that that brings to my teams, and really excited to see where we can leverage that as a strength versus a potential distractor.
Carraig, thank you. Cynthia, thank you. I found Cynthia via a TED talk she did on the topic. I saw it, I was blown away. This is something I'm highly interested in, and I invited her to the show, and we've been blessed to have her on the show. And Carraig is a charismatic and very open neurodivergent that's going to help us understand a little bit more about it. So thank you so much for both of you. Let's just jump right in. For the uninitiated, we're using terms that people have never heard before. Cynthia, maybe you can help just give a definition of what neurodivergent means and what neurotypical means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start first with the definition of neurodiversity. So that term has been around since the 90s. It really just describes how each of our brains are different, just like fingerprints. So that's the diversity of a brain, neurodiversity. Neurodivergency is the difference, the specific differences that are found within brains that there's no formal definition. The one that I like to use is really one that describes neurodivergency as being ADHD, autism, anxiety, tic disorders, and then dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. That's the generally accepted, widely accepted definition of what neurodiversity is and neurodivergency. That answers the question.
Thank you for that. And so as I shared earlier, 30% of people are believed to be neurodivergent. That means, newsflash, you are part of a neurodiverse workforce, whether you know it or not. And if you're a leader, you're leading a neurodiverse workforce. And that could sound scary, but I actually think that there's a lot of benefits to it. I'm hoping that each of you can kind of elaborate on some of the benefits or the strengths and even some of the challenges of being neurodivergent. Let's start with you, Carraig.
Yeah, I think going back to your point, there's a lot more folks that are neurodivergent than probably even realize it themselves, right? And as somebody on the spectrum, I think I see it pretty quick in a lot of times, whether people want to admit they have it or not, right? That's generally not something that we're going to really provoke, but the skills that come with it, like in the tech world, the ability to focus and learn things quickly, to adapt and change and dive in and be able to sit there. We have these developers that'll develop for an entire shift, and they're so focused and into it. Or the analysts on the security side who can see that big picture and are able to take that time to learn. The ability to focus and to, as my wife calls it, become an overnight expert is something that's relatively unique, right? So that's something that we can really take advantage of, even if it means we have to go some different routes to find those talented individuals sometimes. But I want to make something kind of at the same time clear, in that there's a lot of different types of neurodivergent folks, right? And I think the strengths, and I mean, I can speak for those of us on the spectrum, at least even that's a spectrum, right? And that's the crazy part about this, is kind of the Wild West, whether you're ADHD or you have other challenges. I mean, whether it's brain trauma, maybe you got in an accident somewhere, maybe you have some speech difficulties, so you can't really communicate that well, but your brain works phenomenally. I mean, there's a lot of these different areas where you maybe are just a little bit different in how you approach problem solving or how you think about things. That doesn't make you inherently bad. It's just, how do we best take advantage of that? And I think the first step is recognizing it, and not putting this label on it necessarily, or not making it seem like a disability. It's weird, Jerich. Every job I've ever had, I have to check that box under the disabilities. Do you have this disability? I don't see myself as disabled. I wouldn't be where I am. I wouldn't have been able to learn this career as fast as I have if I was disabled. That's not how I look at it. But every job I've ever had, are you disabled? Right? And I think we have to change the stigma that just because somebody thinks differently doesn't mean that they're necessarily negative, right? It's all about that diversity of thought, going back to this DEI effort. This is part of that. And so some of the challenges is there's strengths. Obviously, we're thorough, we can focus on something really well. The challenges are that it's really hard to focus on things we don't care about. So if you have team members who you feel are on the spectrum, and again, I'm speaking mostly from the autism side, it's important to find a way to get them interested in it, because if they're not, it's going to be really hard to get production out of it, right? You've got to make it interesting. But at the same time, it's like, for me personally, like, emotions are another thing that a lot of us struggle with on the autism side. So I look at it a lot like being colorblind. If you go and find somebody who's colorblind, my brother-in-law is colorblind, right? Red and green, can't tell the difference. You can have a lot of fun with that in new situations. But when he's driving a car, the red light and green light are no less real to him than they are to anybody else. In that specific situation, he's figured out, his brain has made the connection of what's red and what's green. He can drive just fine. It's no less real. And that's kind of how my life has been from an emotions perspective, right? So growing up, I always had these I'd get in fights all the time. I had a massive temper because I get these emotions. I didn't know how to deal with them. It would result in anxiety. I'd lose my temper, and it was a mess. And so some of this takes some deliberate figuring out of how do you map that stuff out in the same way. Because as I get older and I go through more events, right, I can map it better. But that's kind of some of the challenges side is it's not just pros, there's also cons, but I don't think that's unique to us either.
That so much to unpack there, man. So much to unpack. So you talked about the fact that, yeah, you can dive in deeper and be a little bit more tunnel vision. So of course you're going to be able to become a subject matter expert a little bit faster. And that's what I've experienced and what I've seen a lot of as well. And from a challenges perspective, there are different challenges, but neurotypicals have challenges too, right? Everybody has challenges. And the difference is with neurodivergent, you can kind of box them in a little bit more. You never know what you're gonna get with a neurotypical. So I can appreciate that. The point that I really hear really clearly is we're not all the same, right? I mean, there's Asperger's, there's ADHD, there's dyslexia, there's different levels of autism, there's PTSD. I mean, there's a lot of things that make us think differently, but the key word is different. And different is at the core of diversity. And now we're talking about cognitive diversity. And cognitive diversity has a lot of benefits as well. And then the last thing that I think I heard you talk about was disabilities. I love that you're acknowledging that it's a disability, even though that you shouldn't, because the reality is it's a hidden disability. It's one of those disabilities that nobody knows unless you tell them, if not, they think you're like this weird guy, or they think you're this angry guy, or they think you're all these other things. And we're slowly starting to see those stigmas leave. But that's why we're having this conversation today, is someone is watching and thinking, is that me? Or is that Johnny? Right. And that is what we're trying to hopefully address. Cynthia, what are your thoughts?
Oh my gosh, I have so much to say. I'll try to keep it concise. So Carraig, I love what you said about reducing the stigma of disability, and not even calling it that. I personally, I have always referred to it as a difference. It's just different. And if we have at least 30% of the population, that's an estimate, and that's an estimate based on the little numbers that we have as real facts. Then there's a ton of people that are not diagnosed and never will be. So, personally, I think that it's far more than 30% of the population. So therefore, it's not even a minority anymore at this point, right? So it's like, and it not only is it not a minority, but it stretches through all, races, genders, everything of people. So it really is the one qualifying thing that we have between all people, all walks of life. There's neurodiversity, neurodivergency everywhere. So I also agree with getting rid of the label. That's a long process, but the more that we can just look at how different brains work and then make environments that support those different workings, it doesn't matter if you're diagnosed or not, or if you're neurodivergent or not. You might prefer to have your information presented to you visually because you're more of a visual learner. It doesn't have anything to do with autism or ADHD or anything, but that's the goal. That's where I'd like to get to at some point. I think we're getting closer. But I also, and I know that the original question is talking about strengths. I will get there in just a moment. But I also want to say that women and females often present differently. So that is, we're missed. A lot of the times we're missed or misdiagnosed or, given a wrong diagnosis because we look different with ADHD as well as with autism. And it's much more hidden because our traits, the way that we present with these differences, can just be looked at as, oh, cute or typical for a female or, whatever kind of thing it is. It doesn't stand out as much. So some of the strengths, though, like Craig was saying, are that we have an intense ability to focus. We can really focus on what's interesting to us. We can stay there. We're very curious. We're also extremely empathetic. There's a high level of empathy and energetic feeling of other people in autism as well as ADHD. We're very good at recalling details, asking detailed questions. We process really, really quickly. Special interests might actually be really beneficial for a career, especially in IT, right? You're really interested in computers, that's a special interest, you dive in, you're great at your job. Creativity is huge, particularly with ADHD, but with autism as well. That ability to think outside the box and to see things from a different angle or a different perspective it's huge. And in the right environment and with the right support, we thrive. I mean, all of these things, we get to present all of those abilities within a team even. Some things that can be a little difficult, sometimes we're overly literal. We don't really read nonverbal cues very well. Our communication style or what we understand or interpret what somebody's saying may be very different than what's being said. Obviously, social challenges, right? We might just miss some social cues. Communication challenges as well. Carraig was saying that as well. Procrastination, being distracted, fatigue, getting tired easily because all the sensory processing can really wear us out. Overwhelmed, sensory challenges. Obviously, if you have a reading disability, then you can have difficulty with printed material. But those are, in general, the main parts that I was talking about.
Thank you for that. And typically I would go and respond to that, but I think we're going to address a lot of that in some of the follow-on questions that I have. So I'm gonna move us on to the next thing, which I think we'll start to figure out. Okay, we're understanding a little bit about this. The next thing is, okay, what do we do about it as leaders, as people that are working with these people. But before we can get there, I think you have to truly understand the people that you're working with. And as people that are neurodivergent and work with neurodivergence all the time, what is generally misunderstood about it? Because you guys have given us a lot of information, but I imagine, Carraig, you're misunderstood often, right? Especially when you tell people, "Oh, I have Asperger's." Like, well, they're like, "Oh," like, what do people misunderstand that you wish they would understand a little bit better?
I think that the biggest challenge that I face in the neurotypical world these days is this. I'm very blunt, kind of going back to Cynthia's point. It is what it is. I struggle to rationalize the niceties that go around a lot of those things that a lot of folks need in their lives. So when I say things, I tend to get to the point. But that's taken as being rude or as being too assertive or things like that all the time, right? So I think one of the biggest misconceptions or misunderstandings is that people think I'm either a jerk or I'm being mean or I'm out to get somebody, when the reality is my brain works in a very kind of a fact-based world, right? So it is what it is. And in the same way, I don't really get my feelings hurt very easily either. People can give me much harsher criticism than I think most can take, because again, I'm seeing it from a fact-based world. And if I can align the criticism or the critique to what's actually happening, it makes sense. Like, as long as 1+1 = 2 in my world, we're good, right? And so the misunderstanding part, I mean, literally growing up, everybody thought I was a jerk until I started to learn to kind of, tamp it down a bit. As once I found out I didn't find out I was on the spectrum until I was 20, 23, 24 years old. So my entire childhood, my parents knew, they didn't tell me, a long story, but all my friends, they thought that I was just this asshole, excuse my language. But the reality was that was never the intent, right? Never the intent. It was just how I communicated. So for me, that's the number one thing, is that, and I think the other thing that's misunderstood is, for me, when I'm focused on something, when I'm interested in something, that is fun. Like, that's enjoyable. So for me, work-life balance looks a little bit different than it might for somebody else. Because if I'm in it, like for me, when I'm in a project, when my mind's working on, and I have that tunnel vision, I'm working on this, trying to get this thing done, whether it's slides or whether it's a new idea I have, it's like playing video games. Like, that to me is fun. For me, it's the grind of having to do stuff that I don't want to do that becomes tough. But if my mind's in that mode of just focus, then I don't have to really worry as much about the work-life balance concerns, because I really enjoy it.
So you're making a point, and it goes back to something that Cynthia said earlier. You said, you like to get to the point.
Mm-hmm.
My experience is that neurodivergent people want you to get to the point with them as well. Just as much as you get to the point when you're communicating, that they also want the same thing. This flies in the face of my favorite part of our show, which I'm not going to do because this show is specifically to go against that to a degree. But I love metaphors and analogies. I love explaining things with pictures and rosy language. And I have a neurodivergent son, and I've tried that with him. And I think he's looking at the back of my head as I'm trying to talk to him. He's like, I don't get what you're saying. What are you trying to tell me, Dad? Right. And I've taken this to the workplace where I do have neurodivergent workers. And am I on the right path? Is that also the same for you, Carraig?
I struggle with analogies for me to understand things. That's true. But I will say that one of my coping mechanisms, being on the spectrum as an executive in cybersecurity, is becoming good at telling analogies, because, to your point, for other folks, they seem to go over really well. People love analogies. And so it's more a situation of doing what works. But you're right. Like, as far as I'm concerned, I would rather you just give it to me straight.
Awesome. Cynthia, what do you hear people consistently misunderstanding about neurodivergence?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that feelings and emotions is the number one thing for sure. I think one of the misconceptions is that people who are neurodivergent, and when I say this, I'm thinking autism primarily, don't have feelings, right? Like, oh, they don't feel, which is completely untrue, or that they're not empathetic, which is also completely untrue. The way that we present when emotions happen for us can be very opposite. Sometimes I laugh when things aren't funny, not because I think that they're funny. It's just like a tension release, I guess, right? So growing up, I lost a lot of friends because they maybe fall and hurt themselves on the playgrounds, and I would laugh. It was, it's like, it wasn't that I thought it was funny, it just, so sometimes our emotions don't present in a way, where you're sad and you're just flat faced, right? So there's a lot of misconception around that, I think, for sure. And I think everything that Carraig was saying is really true too, right? Like that ability to want information straight on and have people not understand that that's what you want. And part of the reason is like, it's confusing. If somebody's giving you all this, they're trying not to hurt your feelings and they're going around backwards to get there. It's like, just tell me what you want. Like, I just don't understand. So it's really helpful, really helpful. We can deal with our emotions or whatever after, if we need to. So I think that's really important as well. And, I think also that there's misconceptions, like, when I started, sharing that I thought that I was autistic with people, they're like, well, you don't seem like it. Right? So it's like, oh, okay, so you have a version of what you think that my brain looks like on the inside. It's really just the way that we process information. So, again, like you were saying, asking about analogies, and non-literal language can be very difficult, but sometimes really literal analogies, like there's a complicated problem and you're describing it in some other fashion, can be very helpful. So, you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Like, it's confusing, right? But people, we have a lot of ideas of what we think that looks like.
No, that's a great point. And Carraig, you said something so this is a cyber show, and one of the aspects of cyber is things aren't always black and white, and risk is a perfect example of that. For the person that may think, well, if he thinks that everything is black and white, how does he handle the spectrum of risk? How would you respond to that?
Right. When it comes to things like risk, it's about how do we quantify it? That's why I'm probably one of the biggest fans of the fair risk model out there, right? Because when you can start putting more data behind it, well, now it's not quite so black and now it's not quite so gray anymore, because we can actually have data. But you're right. If we're going to do t-shirt sizes, if we're going to, it's about this. I really struggle with that, because what are you basing that on? What's the data behind that? Because my mind kind of works almost like a calculator, I think, in some ways, as far as like, does it make sense? Does it not make sense from a logic perspective? And if you're just going to throw a number out there, $50 million or $100 million risk, without any kind of data to back it up, but a gut feel, you're right. I really struggle with that. But the great thing is that in most areas, there's ways to quantify things. We have the FAIR framework in cyber. There's a number of other ones as well for things like that. But that is an absolute challenge that we have to work through.
If I'm a CEO or a CFO, I'm like, so Carraig is not going to BS me. I like it, right?
I will tell you, though, it's a challenge, though, because if you think about from a business perspective, going back to the people problem, because cyber is a people business. It is, absolutely. And the business will say, hey, we want this new feature. And if you deploy it today, I'll make an extra $1 million. I'll make an extra $3 million or whatever it is, right? The numbers that are thrown out on the business side tend to often be exaggerated. This is the sales side of the house. This is the, going out there side of the house. And so sometimes it's hard to compete with that when, to your point, you're trying to make sure that you're the one that's not double counting. You're the one that's not going out there and blowing things up and exaggerating for the sake of exaggerating or to try to get the deal through. It's a struggle.
And also, I want to say this is such a perfect example of how both minds working together, right, are so perfect. Like we want the intuitive mind. It's like, well, I kind of think this is the way things are going. And then we want the analytical mind. It's like, well, wait a minute, let's make sense about this, because it just makes the workplace stronger, right? It just makes everything more rich and realistic.
I like that. And going into how each mind adds value, to me, that means we need to find a way to accommodate these minds. And as someone that is diagnosed, Carraig, what are the accommodations that you think could help increase your chances of success?
Patience. Patience. I think having awareness, so I work at a company called Avnet now. And just my first 2 or 3 months on the job, when I'd gone through the ring of meeting all the new folks, and I met our DEI group and shared, my story, because I tend to take what I call the 8 Mile rule. I don't know if you've seen the movie 8 Mile with the Eminem story, right? Where at the very last rap, and I hope I don't give us away to anybody, and everybody should have seen the movie by now. But at the very end of the movie, he kind of wins, right, by owning his own narrative. And I've found that in my professional role, whether it's with a new team or with a new group of peers, if I'm more upfront about the fact that, hey guys, it may come across this way, but that's not what I mean. Like, just ask me if you think that, if you think something's off, ask me. I'll be honest about it. And I found that to be a much more successful strategy. And so as part of that process, they actually worked with me, and we put a whole article out for that month for our intranet for the whole company on, hey, here's what neurodiversity is all about, and here's Carraig, our new head of security, and here's his thoughts on it, and here's his story. And that was awesome, right? Because that's basically me pulling the 8 Mile trick on the whole company, kind of, in a sense, owning that narrative and educating people. But being educated is really important. If you have people on your team that know it, or if you're somebody like me and you're working with a boss that recognizes the differences, it's obvious. It's obvious immediately when somebody has taken the time to even try to understand. Not that anybody maybe can fully, but that they try. It's obvious. But then have patience, right? Ask questions. A lot of times we tend to jump to conclusions. We tend to look at those stigmas, and we see that stigma, and we get it set in our head that they must be a certain way because, they didn't treat me right, or they didn't handle themselves right in this situation. Instead of wondering why, asking why is so important. And the fortunate thing with people like me is we'll tell you exactly why.
Not only will you tell us, you'll be blunt when you tell us, and it'll be unfiltered when you tell us, but we know we got everything that you were thinking, and I can appreciate that. Sometimes it hurts. I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes it hurts, but I know it's real. So I can appreciate that.
I would say that, as people mature in knowing, especially if they know that they're on the spectrum, right? There's some really good resources out there that help people like me better understand neurotypical folks. And part of that process, my wife, thank God, for 10 years, she's been kicking me under the table anytime I said something that was off, right? So we can be trained to get along better it doesn't have to be the neurotypical has to come all the way to meet the neurodivergent where they're at, right? And I don't like the idea of people that say, oh no, you have to come all the way and meet me where I'm at. I think that it's perfectly fair to expect that both sides should be learning about how to work better together and meet in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot.
All right, so I have a two-part question. First one is for you. Second one is for you, Cynthia. But if you're an employee, or you're just a person, whether you're in cyber or not, right? You are watching this and you suspect that you just might be neurodivergent. You're hearing things and you're like, oh, that's me. That's me. A lot of these things are converging. This really could be me. What should you do next?
There's some awesome groups. The InfoSec Twitter, InfoSec LinkedIn, lots of folks talking about it, being open about it. There is a growing movement of folks who just accept it, right? Who are happy to talk about it. I changed my little tagline on LinkedIn to state neurodivergent a while back because I found that, in fact, I think, do we have time for a quick story?
Let's do it.
So back when I was at H&R Block, and I'll do a call out to them on this, I was approached by an employee who's had a family friend who had just diagnosed that they were on the spectrum, for example, right? So I met this kid for lunch, gave him some resources. Hey, go read this book, go read that, and then see if that helps. And he came back, 4 or 6 weeks later, and had all these great questions. Like, he had read this book, he had done his homework, he had questions by page. Hey, on this page, when it says this, what does that mean to you? Like, how does that work? So this was a kid that obviously put some work into stuff. And then when I heard his story that he hadn't made it through a single interview successfully for cyber, because one of the things that we do, right, is we hyperanalyze, kind of going back to Cynthia's point. So his challenge, especially being newly diagnosed, is he would go into an interview, they would ask him a question, he would answer the question. And then he would be so hyper focused on analyzing how he answered the question that he would essentially derail the rest of the interview. And so working with H&R Block, because this was a kid that had a degree in IT. I think it was actually cybersecurity specifically. And I believe at the time he was a forklift driver, right? So because he couldn't get an interview. So we worked with H&R Block's HR team and brought him on as a intern. Not your typical intern, but this was a kid that struggled to interview. So we figured if he doesn't work interviewing the traditional way, let's give him a 6-week on the job interview, basically. That kid is still there. He's one of their best engineers. Well, like I say, for his junior level, but he's a rock star right now. And he stayed on after being an intern. He got the job and he moved forward. So I posted that story on LinkedIn, and I got hundreds of messages, hundreds of people saying, "That's me. That's me. Why won't companies give me a chance? That's me." And it was at that point I'm like, I've kind of historically been a little bit quiet about my own story because it's not the easiest thing to talk about, but it kind of made that gut punch, right? It's like, holy crap, like this is not as, I don't even have a big following on LinkedIn, and here's hundreds of people reaching out, hundreds, saying, hey, that's my story. Like I can't get a company to do that with me. And here we have this guy that's kicking butt. Like this is doing amazing work. So how many people are we missing by not giving them that chance? And so I guess for me, that's where it goes back to finding somebody who's going to be your advocate, who gets it. And the great thing is while still a growing need, we're seeing more and more of these talks on neurodiversity. It's getting out there. We're starting to see more ERG groups at companies that are focused on it. It's starting to be recognized. And I think that as we recognize it, we can start catering to it.
First, I love that story. That story may be how I found you. I'm not 100% sure yet. I think that what you did changed a life and probably changed a lot of other lives. And I'm not shy in saying that I hope this video, this recording changes a life, if not multiple lives. That's literally why we're doing this and why I think this is the most important one. I've heard you use the word kid often, and I hone in on that for one reason. There's a topic that's not being discussed, which is there is a convergence of neurodiversity and generational diversity, in that baby boomers, they just weren't diagnosed. Gen X, they just weren't diagnosed. Millennials, more specifically Gen Zers, are entering the workforce in many ways knowing that they are neurodivergent, knowing that they need certain accommodations. And this is called leading in a neurodivergent workforce because as leaders, this is your incoming talent class. This is your existing talent class. You have to be able to accommodate if you want to get the most out of them and allow them to be the best versions of themselves. You're going to hire people. You're only going to get a portion of them if you don't find a way to truly foster an environment that they can be successful in and comfortable in. It's on you as leaders to figure that out. And hopefully this is a starting point. And SANS has a neurodivergence summit coming up, and Cynthia and others are posting links. This is your new reality, like it or not. And that is why we're having these conversations. And Carraig's story is an example that people can be successful. They can be really successful because there are certain things that are brought to the table as a result. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you once again for your vulnerability, Carraig. So Cynthia, to the point, this is about leaders. And I'm going to put you in another scenario. You're a leader and you are now interested in this topic. You are now saying, oh, maybe something that Carraig or Cynthia or Jerich is saying is making sense. What do you do next as a leader if you either suspect that you have someone that's neurodivergent or you just know that it's out there somewhere in your workforce? What do you do next to help with this area?
That was a great question. I mean, it sounds like an easy question, but it's not an easy answer. I mean, first, really trying to understand it from a neurodivergent perspective is really good. I think immediately if I was in that position and my company didn't already have DEI around neurodiversity, which companies should, that's really important. So if you do, then go find out about it from your organization. If you don't, then do what you can to educate yourself about reading about it. If you have a close friend, a family member, a coworker, anybody that you know is out about this, I would say talk with them. There's a lot of organizations that are available now, and a lot of people who are starting to do work like this with companies. One of the things that I do is actually I work to educate organizations about neurodiversity and neurodivergency and how that applies to them in the workforce, and how it affects their working teams. I've done this work in the IT industry as well. Even just roundtable discussions, right? Like I've led panel discussions about it. And the more that you do this, just there's going to be always people that are out already, right? Like Carraig is, or other people. They're like, hey, this is me. This is who I am. You often become the seed in the workplace, right? That other people then come to, and allows other people to even come out about their own differences, whether they're diagnosed and they're hiding them or they're not diagnosed. But so starting somewhere close to where you are and branching out, right? Having those difficult discussions is really, I think paramount. I think that communication is key. And when we start there with authenticity and communication, that's what's going to make change. But, if you don't know, right? If you don't know if somebody's neurodivergent and you're like, hey, I think you're autistic, that's really not a good way to do it. So you don't want to go diagnosing people because you've got a little bit of information and some knowledge now, and you think that you can tell your workforce who they are. So again, I'm going to go back to just thinking about, like Carraig said a while ago, like asking that why question, right? Why is somebody doing this, or what is happening? You can ask anybody that. It doesn't matter if they're diagnosed, if you think that they're autistic, if you're certain that they have ADHD, if they're just like your cousin Sally and you know it for a fact, it doesn't really matter. You want to understand from that person's perspective. Hey, I see that sometimes during meetings, people have the answer, but you don't really. And I'm wondering, is there something we can do to keep you more engaged? Or have you noticed that happening to you? Or tell me more about your learning style. I want to know what to do to provide you a good working environment. I value this about you, and these are my concerns. I think if we can take off that label, it's going to serve us a lot better in the long run. Carraig's lucky that he has a diagnosis and that he can talk about it and that he knows how that looks. And while, it shouldn't actually apply that you have to check the box saying you have a disability, in some ways, it's a great service that you're able to understand that, because like, the person that you talked about who missed out on all the interviews, well, that's a real problem. I mean, so starting in the workplace is like one of the goals that we have as neurodivergent experts is to change the interview process, because we know that we don't interview well. I've bombed interviews too. Like, I get stuck in my head, just like we were talking about. You're like, oh my God, I answered that question completely wrong. And then they answer something else, ask something else, and you're stuck on how you did poorly on this question. And you bomb the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, because our brains don't work in that way under pressure. So, we want to capture as many good workers and people in our environment as we can, and doing that by changing our practices is really what we need. So that's a long answer for start, give you some answers, and then look and see what your organization can do. Are there people that they can reach out to? That's a really important thing. And there's a couple of links too that I wanted to talk about. I know you had asked Carraig, like, well, what if somebody thinks that maybe they are this way? There's actually a quiz called the Autism Quotient Quiz, which is not something you can use to diagnose, to get diagnosed. Like if you went to get tested, they're not going to give you this test, but it's by, it's actually, Temple Grandin just referenced it also in her most recent book. She's a famous autistic author and scientist. And it has a high level of reliability. So it's very, it's like 15 minutes long, maybe. It's a pretty interesting little quiz. I think that's fascinating. I know I took it along with my husband. I had asked, or my former husband, I asked him to take it too. And I was like, oh, we'll probably score the same. We're so similar. And I was like way in the autistic range, and he I scored like 40, I don't know, 28, I think it was like pretty close to high, and he scored 6. And I was like, oh, maybe it's interesting. So that's one thing too. And I have a blog that I keep too, and some information on my website, cynthiacoupe.com, if people want to check that out at all. And I'm also on LinkedIn, Cynthia Coupe. So those are some.
Thank you for that. First, I realized I said your name wrong at the beginning. It's Cynthia Coupe. I asked you before the show and I still got it wrong. So
Okay. It's my whole life. It's not a problem.
I apologize for that. And speaking of doing things wrong, I've known not to ask somebody if they're a neurodivergent, but I have asked a lady when she was due, and she wasn't. And it's the same thing. It's the same thing, especially if they're neurotypical. Do not ask somebody that question. You named a lot of accommodations. I want to give a small shout out to Dutch Shorts from AWS. We were having a small conversation on the side, and he was like, hey, some neurodivergent people don't like to be on camera, and we're in a world where people just want to be on camera all day. And it got me thinking, anyone that's watching this, if you're comfortable identifying as neurodivergent, neurodivergent people, throw some accommodations in the chat that you think should be considered at the very least. I'd love to have a laundry list of accommodations. There are things that are well known on websites, but you know what works best for you, and that might work best for somebody else. So throw it in the chat. I'd love to see what type of dialogue we can get on that. This has been an amazing show, and I want to throw one final thing out there. The word disability is misconstrued and is overused, and this is a good example of that, as we kind of talked about. This is a quote unquote hidden disability if you want to go that far. But what I want to point out is Carraig is a Fortune 500 CISO. You do not have a ceiling because you are tagged with neurodivergence. It is so important for you to see an example of this. He doesn't seem like some weirdo. He's not like, he doesn't have foil on his head. People can operate in society and have different levels of cognitive diversity. And if this is you, I just want you to be encouraged that you too can find a way to succeed. You're going to have to figure out the right accommodations. You're going to have to develop and grow. But this is something that a lot of people are dealing with. You are not alone in this. And if you're just now finding out about it, embrace it as a leader or as someone that is going to be a leader one of these days. Ultimately, this is the world that we're operating in. And thank you, Carraig. Thank you, Cynthia, for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, and hopefully making this industry a better place as a result.